Hello, my name's Sean Kehoe. I'm the chairman of UKIP in the Erewash constituency, and I'm continuing with a short mini-series of talks on Brexit, explaining it and also looking today at some of the complicated words and phrases that keep cropping up that people tell me are confusing to them. So I want to try and address some of this. I also want to address some of the Project Fear issues that are being put about to cause people to be afraid of having a proper Brexit, and in particular to be afraid of having a no-deal Brexit. Now, let me just briefly say what my credentials are, because one of the problems with all of this is that it's being implied that we, the unwashed public, are not worthy to hold opinions on these things, and that we need simply to go along with what our masters in the metropolitan elite are telling us. Well, I don't accept that, and I want to be able to speak on these things, but such as they are, these are my credentials. I have a degree in economics. I'm a lawyer. I was a lawyer for 25 years. I was also dual qualified in California, but my main qualification is in England and Wales. But also I was a businessman for nearly 20 years, running my own law firm until I sold it. And on top of that, I've been involved in politics for just over 40 years, since I was a teenager, since I was 15. And so putting all that together, I think that doesn't mean that I'm right in everything I say, but I think it gives me the right to speak into this subject with at least some merit. So let's look at some of these words and phrases that are baffling people and bewildering people, and let's look at what they mean and why they matter. Now, the first one is withdrawal agreement. What's that? Essentially, that is the lengthy document that has been drawn up by our government and the European Union to govern and regulate our ongoing relationship with them after we leave the European Union. Now, I'm going to talk about that more in the next talk, because there's many problems with that document, which make it, you could say, worse than just simply remaining in the European Union. It's been incompetently drafted at the very least, but I think it's been deliberately badly drafted so that we won't want to leave the European Union. And I think I can show some solid evidence for saying that. The next word I want to look at is customs union. What on earth is this? We keep hearing about it. What it is, it's a group of countries, and in this case it's the European Union members, who join together for trading purposes to make a kind of club. And what that club does is it is agreed between them that they will not impose tariffs on each other, but they will impose a common tariff on countries outside the customs union. So what on earth does that mean? What are tariffs? Well, basically, when we're trading, if we want to import from, say, another country like America or Brazil or somewhere else, Japan, if you're inside the customs union, then a tariff must be paid to discourage you from buying from those countries and to encourage you instead to buy from the countries within the European Union, the customs union. Now you might say, well, that's fine, what's the problem? That means it's easy for us to trade with each other inside the customs union, the European Union. Well, no, it's not fine. There's a problem there, because the fact that under the rules of the customs union we have to impose tariffs on the outsiders, and the fact that there are 164 of them but only 28 countries inside the customs union, means that we are making it harder for ourselves to trade with the rest of the world. So in return for having easier trade with the customs union in Europe, we're making it very difficult to trade elsewhere. Now, given that there's 164 of those nations outside the customs union and only 28 inside it, that is not a smart idea. It's not a good deal. We're losing far more than we would gain from it, which is why leaving the customs union and trading outside is not something to be scared of. It's something that's going to be really beneficial to us. All right, another word, single market. This is a very similar idea, in the sense that you have this group of nations, and in addition to not imposing tariffs against each other's goods, they also, as part of the single market, agree various multiple different types of regulations and procedures and standards that must apply to the goods that are produced and sold within the single market. So basically, manufacturers in particular are put under great burdens to comply with millions of words of regulation that govern how they must produce things. Now, if we weren't in the single market, we could just make things the way we want to. We wouldn't have to comply with all of their regulations and rules. All right, let's look at another word which I think really does send people into a tailspin, and that's the word backstop. What on earth is this thing, a backstop? Now, we need to look at Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the fact that the Republic of Ireland is part of the European Union, whereas Northern Ireland, being part of the United Kingdom, is not. So, if we leave the European Union, then a border would appear between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And this is something which has caused argument and consternation. Now, interestingly enough, well, let's put it this way. By way of an agreement and by way of technology, it would have been possible and is possible for that to be dealt with without causing any trouble. But enabling vehicles to pass through and have no hard or difficult or obstructive border between those two countries. The only snag is it may take some time to do. And so, because that might take some time, the European Union insisted on what they called a backstop, and that was to guarantee that there'd be no hard border until proper trade arrangements have been agreed and put into place. And that's what they call it, the backstop. But what that backstop would involve is essentially Northern Ireland remaining part of the customs union that we've just spoken about, and having to then continue imposing tariffs on outsiders and not being able to agree trade deals with outside nations. So Northern Ireland would be cut off within the United Kingdom in a kind of separate arrangement. Now, Mrs May perfectly correctly objected to that, so she was right so far. But what she then did, very foolishly, was to offer as an alternative to that instead of just Northern Ireland remaining in a customs union, the entire United Kingdom would remain in a customs union on what she called a temporary basis until we can work out a proper arrangement and an agreement, you know, at the end of an interim period, a transition period. Now, the European Union then rejected that. They don't want that because a temporary backstop is not good enough for them. So here's where we've reached an impasse or a blockage in the road over this issue of the boundary between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or between across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And we're stuck on this at the moment. And Mrs May, only a few days ago, tried to slip it across us and trick us into thinking that she'd reached agreement with the European Union on this issue. And the nub of the problem is this. Where there's a problem is that we cannot leave that customs union, that backstop, without their consent. Because of the ineptitude with which the document was drafted, the withdrawal agreement, because of the ineptitude of our negotiators, it's in that document that we have to have the consent of all 27 other nations of the EU in order to bring the backstop to an end, whereby we are in the customs union on this so-called temporary basis. Now, Mrs May tried to trick us into thinking that this had been resolved and is no longer a problem. But the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox QC, he stood up in the House of Commons just the other day, and he wasn't willing to perjure himself in the House of Commons or to give misleading advice on the law. And so he, to her great angst, he said in the House of Commons that this problem of the fact that we cannot get out of this backstop, this temporary customs union without their permission is still the case. So we still can't get out. We would be held hostage, and if we agreed to this under the withdrawal agreement, we would be putting ourselves as their prisoners, unable to get out without their agreement. And the only way out, believe it or not, is if we can show that the members of the European Union are acting in bad faith. But the problem is that legally that's an incredibly difficult thing to prove. You've got to show that the motives of the European Union nations are malicious, they're in bad faith. Very hard to do, but particularly so when, believe it or not, if we do reach a disagreement on that point, are they acting in bad faith? Guess who's going to arbitrate on that point? Yes, the European Court of Justice. They're the ones who decide whether the European Union is in bad faith. You couldn't make it up, could you? A child would not have agreed to that as a term within the withdrawal agreement. But that's what Mrs. May has agreed to. And that's why when you hear argument about the backstop and the customs union and so on, it is not just people arguing about trivial little pieces of nonsense that don't matter. These are really important issues. And the Brexiteers, those brave Conservatives and the DUP and others, one or two in the Labour Party, who are standing up for Britain and refusing to cave in on this, they are right. And they're doing the right thing to fight on this. Anyway, I'll come back to, no doubt, to the backstop in other talks, because I agree it is complicated and people are struggling with it. All right, let's look at this phrase, World Trade Organization. What's that? Well, briefly, it's, as I said, these 164 nations which have got arrangements in place to govern trade throughout the world, and that's what we, at the moment, are not trading under. But if we leave the European Union, so we leave the customs union and all that, and we go out into the fresh air and trade with the whole world, we'd be trading under what's called WTO terms. No problem at all. It's presented as something terribly frightening. It's not. It would give us far more scope to trade than we presently have. Not least because the vast majority of the world's population is not in the European Union. Population and also wealth is not in the European Union. All right, another phrase, Article 50. What is that when it's at home? Well, it's a clause within what's called the Lisbon Treaty, and it was drafted in order to regulate what would happen if a country was ever to leave the European Union, which they never expected to happen, and they never intended that clause to be used. Until, to their great surprise, our referendum resulted in it having to be used. So it's the means by which you exit the European Union under their terms as set out in that treaty. Now, I'm going to go on in future talks to explain why we shouldn't be using that at all. What we should have done instead is simply to repeal the 1972 Act by which we joined what was then called the European Economic Community. And we should just repeal that. And if we did that, like chopping a tree down, you cut right across the trunk and every part of the tree falls down. We would be free from everything, and we could have just walked away in 2016 and said, goodbye, we're leaving, we're no longer part of the European Union. If you want to talk to us about anything at all, trade and cooperation on any number of matters, we are totally, absolutely available and willing to talk, but you must come and talk to us on our terms, and we will agree to what we want to agree to, and we won't agree to what we don't want to agree to. And whilst we're talking, we will not be paying you anything or doing anything for you or cooperating with any of your rules and regulations or obeying you or getting our laws from you or listening to your European court or anything like that. That's what we should have done. Anyway, more of that next time. But Article 50 is what Mrs. May chose to go under. And basically, we now are having to leave the European Union in the way that they say. We seek their permission. We follow their rules and their procedures. We almost have to go cap in hand asking if it's all right. Would you mind if? Is it okay if we do this? And that shouldn't be the way that we do it. We should just be telling them what we're going to do, not asking them what we can do. All right, another phrase, the four freedoms. Now this is part of the single market, and it's something which is in place within the single market. Four freedoms: the free movement of goods, of services, of capital and of labour. Now the first three don't cause so much problems, except insofar as the movement of goods is regulated by the requirement for us all to have the same rules, standards, sizes, measurements, quality standards, environmental standards and all that, which puts a great deal of a burden on us. But be that as it may, the biggest of those four is the free movement of labour. That's the big one that causes us great difficulty, because most of the movement is into the United Kingdom, not out of it, because people want to live here for obvious reasons. It's a great country. All right, what's another phrase? The transition period. What's that? Well, basically, the first thing we have is when we trigger Article 50, we then have a 2-year period during which a withdrawal agreement is negotiated. We've been through that, it's nearly over. Mrs May waited till the very last minute before she triggered Article 50. 2 years then went by, and now after that you have this transition period, which will go right up to the 31st of December 2020, during which we're kind of semi in the European Union, if we depart in the way that's being proposed. But what else? What other ongoing obligations would we have? Now, concerning the European Court of Justice and any arbitration over any difficulties or disputes arising between us and the European Union, we're agreeing under this withdrawal agreement that for 8 years, even after the end of the transition period, which is the end of 2020, for a further 8 years, we remain subject to the European Court of Justice in determining and trying any points on which we want to arbitrate. So again, you just couldn't make it up. We remain, in a sense, a vassal state. We remain subject to their rules and their jurisdiction, and we remain subservient to them, and we just simply should not agree to it. So that's why the withdrawal agreement is such a bad thing, and I'll come on to that more tomorrow. Anyway, that's all for now. Please come back for future talks on this. Thank you.